This video has been made possible thanks to Conflict of Nations. In this episode of VisualPolitik, we are going to talk about a very serious topic, nuclear weapons. And we are going to talk about them in an incredibly sensitive context. This is probably the first time since the Cold War there has never been so much possibility of them being used. I know it might seem strange for some people to talk about war video games when we are witnessing a real war every day on our screens. But make no mistake, Conflict of Nations is a video game that, like chess, doesn't actually hurt anyone. It's the ideal pastime for those of us who like to spend some time speculating on the defensive capabilities of different countries without having to actually harm anyone. We wish Vladimir Putin had devoted his free time to Conflict of Nations instead of destroying the lives of so many people. In Conflict of Nations, you will be in control of the armed forces of one of the world's leading nations, manage the economy, diplomacy, weapons research, and troop mobilization to lead your nation to victory. Once you have an account, you can play the game on PC or mobile. And now, the best of all, you can unlock your exclusive gift of 13,000 units of gold and get 1 month of premium subscription for free by clicking the link in the description. This offer is only available for 30 days, so be quick and start mobilizing your troops and planning your battle. Vladimir Putin is obsessed with history books, particularly, and I'm sure this comes as no surprise, with all those dealing with the imperial past of Mother Russia. And keep in mind, it's not just about the reading. In the Kremlin, and in general throughout Russia, Putin has placed statues of historic monarchs such as Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. And this VisualPolitik, viewers, gives us many clues as to what is happening. Why? Well, precisely because these two Russian monarchs conquered a good part of what we know today as Ukraine for Russia. Of course, Putin takes it much further. For him, Ukraine is indisputably part of Russia, and therefore, so are its history and its people. For example, in 2016, just outside the gates of the Kremlin, Putin had a statue of Vladimir the Great, who was the Grand Prince of the Principality of Kiev in the 10th century, erected. Of course, for Putin, Prince Vladimir was a full-blooded Russian. In fact, the very same Russian who embraced Christianity and fulfilled the national spirit of what is today Mother Russia. So it makes no sense to talk about the history of Ukraine. In fact, in 2008, Putin himself told US President George Bush that Ukraine is not a real country. And on the eve of the cruel invasion that unleashed the terrible war we are witnessing today on Ukrainian territory, he accused Vladimir Lenin of betraying and destroying the Russian Empire by creating a new republic, the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine, along with 13 other republics beside Russia. And do you know what? Everything indicates that he sees himself as the leader, the one responsible for rebuilding the Russian Empire. In exactly this same vein, on the 9th of June 2022, at a meeting with young entrepreneurs, Putin said two things. Firstly, that Ukraine is not and never will be a sovereign country. He even spoke of a colony. And secondly, he compared himself to Peter the Great when he fought the Great Northern War against Sweden for 21 long years to restore Russia to greatness. Now, this is VisualPolitik and not some history class. Of course, history can play a very important role, but the past can never predetermine the present or the future. Regardless of whether or not Ukraine was part of Russia, or whether or not its inhabitants speak Russian, today it is an independent and sovereign country. Just as the United States, Australia, Canada, and Ireland are independent from the United Kingdom. They're passed as part of the British Empire, and the fact that they speak English does not give London any historical rights, but the Russian leader doesn't give a damn about any of this. In 2021, he published a treatise of about 5,000 words on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, a document in which Putin argues that Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians form one and the same people, which Moscow now has to reintegrate by hook or by crook, mostly by crooks. And that is exactly what Putin attempted on the 24th of February when he launched what he thought would be a swift, successful, and glorious invasion of Ukraine. Of course, as we all know, what happened next was totally different. Right now, Putin no longer has the opportunity to be the builder of the new improved Russian Empire, but rather to be the one responsible for sinking the motherland. His campaign in Ukraine has shattered the Russian army, which is now going from defeat to defeat, and has even lost the flagship of the Black Sea Navy. To make matters worse, he is now on the way to sinking the national economy as well. Vladimir Putin is becoming the worst enemy of Russian imperial ambition. The disaster has been so great that of the 190,000 troops that made up the initial invasion force, the casualties between dead and wounded are estimated at about 100,000.
The Russian military has performed worse than I could ever have imagined. It is too early to plan a victory parade here, but I think that Ukrainians are on the verge of achieving irreversible momentum as long as we, the West, continue to stand with them. Ben Hodges, former commanding general of the US armies in Europe.
A good example of the campaign is the strategic city of Kupiansk on the banks of the Oskil River. It's an important crossroads of railroads and roads. Well, for 195 days, this city not only lived under Russian occupation, but also became one of the most important centers of the Russian military administration. Critical supplies to the front lines were organized and passed through here. It was one of the key strongholds in the Moscow war machine. And yet, on 10th of September 2022, the 92nd Mechanized Brigade of Ukraine captured this city and set the blue and yellow flags flying again. Unbelievable, but true. Another example? Well, there is the case of Kherson. The city was filled with posters saying that the city would be Russian forever. Russia had even gone so far, as we will see later, to annex it, along with most of the oblast. However, despite the annexation, the posters and all that had been announced, 8 months after occupying it, the Russians had to withdraw, and the city has become Ukrainian again. But as I said, the worst for Russia may be yet to come. International sanctions are damaging the Russian economy. The oil price cap may end up sinking government revenues, and many young people have died in the war or are fleeing Russia, and many countries are already suspending large contracts with Russian industry. For example, Indonesia and the Philippines have cancelled large military contracts with Russian industry. In the case of Indonesia, we're talking about a multi-million-dollar contract for the purchase of Sukhoi 35 fighters, aircraft that will now be replaced by French and US equipment.
Indonesia's $22 billion purchases of US and French fighter jets. How Russia's Su-35 lost out. Indonesia's about-face from a deal with Russia to new purchase agreements with the US and France highlights the potency of US sanctions.
And that's not the end of it. What's more, the international position is becoming increasingly delicate. Without digging too deep, a commission of inquiry of the United Nations Human Rights Council has published a very harsh report accusing the Russian Federation of committing multiple war crimes during the invasion. We are talking about executions, torture, rape, and of course, the constant bombing of civilian areas and infrastructure. That is to say, the Russian account is broken all over the place. And to make matters worse, the front is getting worse day by day. If the Ukrainians keep pushing and Western aid keeps coming, Russia risks a catastrophic defeat, which could spell the end of Putin himself. And given this situation, there is one question that has spread to the four winds. Would Russia be willing to escalate the conflict and, if necessary, use nuclear weapons? Could this turn the tide of the war? Can the Kremlin reach a peace agreement that will allow it to save face? Well, let's take a look.
The final bullet.
On 30th of September 2022, the Russian president signed the incorporation of the Ukrainian oblasts of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson into the Russian Federation. It was, at least formally, the largest forcible seizure of territory in all of Europe since the Second World War. You could say that Putin's objective with this annexation was to demonstrate to the Russian people that the war was making some sense, that far from being a defeat, Russia was gaining territory. The problem is that it is not exactly happening that way. While it's true that Russia has not delimited the territory it has annexed, which seems like a bad joke, the Ukrainian offensive on Kherson and the expulsion of Russian troops east of the Dnieper River has still been humiliating. While Russian propaganda stated to the world and also to the Russians themselves that Kherson would forever be a Russian city, today it is no longer so. And take note, because following the annexation and from the Russian point of view, the Ukrainian offensives are already being directed against Russia's own territory. So what does this mean? Well, theoretically, and according to Kremlin's own rules, Moscow is now losing the war at home. Therefore, it is no longer possible to speak of a special operation. And the problem, VisualPolitik viewers, is that Vladimir Putin is like a poker addict who always raises the stakes. That, at least, has been the experience so far. For now, he is losing every hand, and this has set off many alarm bells.
20th of November 2022. Kyiv says it is preparing 425 shelters in case of Russian nuclear attack.
Cornered, humiliated, defeated. Changing the course of the war seems practically impossible, but could Putin's regime attempt a nuclear strike that would force the West and Ukraine itself to negotiate a ceasefire? Could the Kremlin take its pressure to the nuclear extreme so that the war ends now and Putin can boast to the Russians on the gains achieved? And keep in mind that we are not talking about any irrational hypothesis. Russia has destroyed its army in Ukraine, but it still has one strength: its nuclear arsenal. And we are no longer talking about large nuclear bombs capable of wiping out entire cities and regions. Instead, its arsenal comprises about 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons of between 1 and 10 kilotons. These are generally much smaller weapons that have never been used in combat, but were designed not to raise a city to the ground, but to engage a conventional army on the battlefield. An arsenal that Putin and the Kremlin's top brass could consider using in a moment of desperation as a coup de force.
We have our own military potential. If someone thinks that we will not use it if there is a serious threat, then he is wrong. Dmitry Novikov, Deputy Chairman of the Duma Foreign Relations Committee. Let's imagine that Russia is forced to use its most formidable weapons against the Ukrainian regime, which has committed a large-scale act of aggression that is endangering the very existence of our state. I believe that NATO will not interfere directly in the conflict even in such a scenario. Dmitry Medvedev, MP.
Putin himself threatened to use nuclear weapons right at the beginning of the invasion. Check it out.
Russia remains one of the most powerful nuclear states. Moreover, it has some advantage in a number of cutting-edge weapons. In this context, there should be no doubt in anyone's mind that any potential aggressor will face defeat and ominous consequences if it directly attacks our country. Vladimir Putin.
And with the arrival of autumn came major setbacks from the battlefield. Threats from the Kremlin multiplied, and that helps explain news stories like this.
10th of November 2022. Top US general urges diplomacy in Ukraine while Biden advisors resist. General Mark A. Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has made the case that the Ukrainians should try to cement their gains at the bargaining table. The 23rd of November 2022. War in Ukraine. Emmanuel Macron announces that he will have a direct contact with Vladimir Putin in the next few days.
Significant Ukrainian advances that have put Russia on the ropes have for the first time multiplied pressure to negotiate a ceasefire and stop the conflict from escalating further. And the question is, if Russia is losing the war, why on earth not dip into its nuclear arsenal? Well, VisualPolitik viewers, there are 6 good reasons why Russia is unlikely to use its nuclear arsenal. Or rather, 6 good reasons why resorting to nuclear weapons would be a tremendous mistake for Russia. So listen up.
Nuclear nonsense.
Using a nuclear weapon to avoid defeat in Ukraine may make some sense until this matter is analysed calmly. The truth is that there are good reasons to believe that Moscow will not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. In particular, we can highlight 6 major ones. Firstly, there are better military alternatives. Let me explain. In the event of resorting to the use of nuclear weapons as a show of force, the logical option would be the use of tactical nuclear weapons against the Ukrainian army. However, contrary to what we might think, the use of these weapons would escalate the conflict while at the same time being unlikely to gain any military advantage. Tactical nuclear weapons are usually fitted to small warheads that are designed to attack large and concentrated combat forces, but the Ukrainian army does not operate with a large concentration of troops and is constantly on the move, so damage would be limited. In fact, for weapons below 10 kilotons, their effects are outweighed by high-precision artillery and thermobaric weapons that have already been used at the front. And so, defeating Ukraine's military capability would require the use of dozens and dozens of tactical nuclear weapons. For example, US military plans during the Cold War called for 136 tactical nuclear bombs to clear out a 100-kilometer or 60-mile front. The current front between Ukraine and Russia stretches for more than 600 kilometers, or 373 miles.
Their nuclear weapons are most useful to them when they don't use them. There is simply no battlefield advantage to using a nuclear weapon. Retired General Ben Hodges, former commanding general of US forces in Europe.
Of course, these weapons could be useful for attacking power plants and infrastructure, but their use would incur a greater number of consequences, without offering significant advantages. And this brings us directly to the second reason. The use of nuclear weapons could not be the end of the problem for Russia, but rather the opposite. It would be the end of the solution. The use of nuclear weapons of any caliber would bring resounding international condemnation, a condemnation far greater than that caused by the war itself. The pressure against Russia would be so great that sanctions would be generalized all over the world, including secondary sanctions that would make relatively friendly countries such as India or the United Arab Emirates unfriendly. Western pressure would reach unimaginable levels, and Russia would become a radioactive country, so to speak. Something like a new North Korea, which of course would be a death blow for Russian citizens and for the country's own oligarchs and managers, who would no longer be able to find refuge. And even countries like China have already made it clear that this is a red line. Why? Because if Russia uses nuclear weapons, non-proliferation agreements would go out the window. Many Southeast Asian countries would jump headlong into developing their own nuclear weapons as life insurance. And all this mess would happen without gaining any military advantage for Russia. But we are not only talking about political or economic reactions. Perhaps there would also be a military one. Washington has been very clear. The use of nuclear weapons would entail a forceful response from the West. This is something that both the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, and the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, have made sure to convey to senior Russian officials.
We have communicated directly, privately, at very senior levels to the Kremlin that any use of nuclear weapons would have catastrophic consequences for Russia, that the United States and our allies will respond decisively, and we have been clear and specific about what that would entail. Jake Sullivan, White House National Security Advisor.
We do not know exactly what kind of response Sullivan is referring to, but what has been leaked is that in the event of a nuclear attack, NATO would respond with a large-scale conventional strike to destroy Russian forces in Ukraine and guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty. Another possible response could be to provide Ukraine with much more advanced and lethal equipment. For example, long-range strike equipment, or even an entire air force. And it is clear that if this response occurs, the result could be the annihilation of Russian forces in Ukraine.
As far as we know, Putin is threatening to use tactical nuclear weapons on Ukrainian soil, not to attack NATO, which means that NATO should respond in a conventional manner. But the response would be devastating. And I guess this is the clear message that the NATO alliance is sending to Russia at the moment. Zbigniew Rau, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland.
We have all seen what happened to the conventional army. On the face of it, Russia should have been able to quickly defeat Ukraine, but corruption, lack of equipment, training shortfalls, and poor maintenance have made the war a nightmare. Well, let's be clear. Russia's nuclear weapons are unlikely to be in much better shape than its conventional forces. And can you imagine what a mistake or failure in using these weapons would mean? It could mean the death blow for the Kremlin. And it could even end up damaging its own military. And bear in mind that this is no slim chance. Russia is a country where we find news stories like this.
8th of December 2020. Russian doomsday planes radio equipment stolen by thieves. Thieves have stolen electronic equipment from a Russian military aircraft known as a doomsday plane for its role in the country's nuclear arsenal, local media report.
And naturally, there is a risk that the escalation would be exponential. This is the fifth reason. Since the Cold War, it has been clear that nuclear weapons were devices of deterrence, not aggression. The use of nuclear weapons could end up causing unimaginable damage to all. That was the balance of mutually assured destruction, in which the Russian bigwigs themselves have been trained. All are aware of the consequences, and all have families and friends. In fact, that makes the use of nuclear weapons unpopular at home as well. For example, Igor Ivanovich Strelkov, a paramilitary leader who was instrumental in the seizure of Crimea and the Donbass War, has made it clear that the use of nuclear weapons would be a mistake and even a crime. All these reasons help explain why nuclear weapons have never been used again, neither in the Korean War, nor in the Vietnam War, nor in Afghanistan, nor in the Ukrainian War itself, despite the fact that Russia has already lost tens of thousands of men. The consequences could be so severe that even if Putin were to lose his head, the incentive to rein him in would be very great. Evidently, if history teaches us anything, it is that reality can end up outweighing any possible scenario. And so, VisualPolitik viewers, beyond the world of the insane, it is unlikely that Russia will ever dip into its nuclear arsenal. Be that as it may, the problem is that Ukraine cannot afford a false start. A peace agreement without major concessions from Russia could permanently doom this country, and that is something Ukrainians would find hard to accept. But having reached this point, it's your turn. Do you think Putin's Russia will dare to use nuclear weapons? Do you think the end of the war may be near? Leave us your thoughts in the comments. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik. Also, remember that if you want to feel like Sun Tzu and speculate on military strategies, the free online PvP strategy game Conflict of Nations is worth checking out. Click on the link in the description to get your unique starter pack, but remember that the offer is only available for 30 days. All the best, see you next time.